Welcome to Dark History for Sleep. Tonight we step into the cold, smoke-stained heart of the 17th century, a world where faith, politics, and greed collided to turn the heart of Europe into a graveyard. When it begins in 1618, the air in the Holy Roman Empire is thick with tension, as if the land itself knows what is coming. For decades, Protestant and Catholic rulers have eyed each other with suspicion, their treaties brittle, their peace kept only by exhaustion from earlier wars. Every noble house whispers of betrayal. Every church preaches that its enemies are heretics. And in the middle, millions of peasants try to survive in a world that treats them as pawns. This is not yet the 30 Years' War, but it is the spark's shadow on the powder barrel. And in Prague, that spark is about to fall. Religious conflict had already fractured the empire. Protestant princes resented the Catholic Habsburgs' growing power. The Habsburgs saw Protestant defiance as rebellion against God himself. The balance of power was fragile, held together by thin agreements, and by the memory of how bloody the last great war had been. But men forget blood when ambition calls. The final push toward chaos would come from an act so strange, so brazen, that history still remembers it simply as the defenestration of Prague. May 23rd, 1618, the royal castle in Prague looms over the city, its walls a symbol of Habsburg authority. Inside, a meeting is underway, one that will decide the future of Bohemia. On one side sit the Catholic envoys of the emperor charged with enforcing his will. On the other, Protestant nobles, furious at the steady erosion of their religious freedoms. The meeting begins with sharp words. It ends with something far more violent. The Protestant lords rise from their seats, their patience gone. They seize the imperial envoys by the arms, dragging them toward an open window. The envoys shout, curse, pray, but it makes no difference. In moments, they are hurled into the air, falling 70 feet into the castle's moat below. It is a moment of defiance, a declaration that the Habsburg crown's authority has been rejected. The envoys survive the fall, by luck or by landing in a heap of refuse, but the act itself is a spark in dry tinder. The message is clear. The Protestants of Bohemia will not submit. The Habsburgs, in turn, will not forgive. The defenestration of Prague is not just a political insult. It is an open challenge to imperial power, and one that will bring mercenaries, kings, and empires into the fight. The 30 Years' War has begun. The defenestration of Prague echoes through Europe like a gunshot. To the Protestant nobles of Bohemia, it is the first strike in a fight for survival. To the Catholic Habsburgs, it is open treason that must be crushed without mercy. Bohemia moves quickly. The Protestant estates form a provisional government, raising their own army to defend against imperial retaliation. They choose a new king, Frederick V of the Palatinate, a Protestant prince with powerful allies in the German states and beyond. Frederick accepts, but his reign will be short and bloody. The Habsburg Emperor Ferdinand II is not a man to tolerate rebellion. A devout Catholic with iron will, he sees the uprising not merely as political defiance, but as an attack on the true faith itself. He calls upon the Catholic League, a coalition of Catholic princes and their mercenary armies, to march into Bohemia. War comes fast. The Catholic forces are disciplined and well-armed, led by seasoned commanders who have fought in earlier conflicts. The Bohemian army is less organized, a patchwork of noble levies, mercenaries, and militia, driven more by zeal than by cohesion. The countryside feels the war first. Imperial troops burn villages suspected of harboring rebels. Protestant forces seize Catholic estates, looting what they can before the enemy advances. Crops are trampled, livestock taken, and peasants flee into the forests with nothing but what they can carry. In a matter of months, the heart of Central Europe is already bleeding. November 8th, 1620, the fields west of Prague are shrouded in cold mist. On the ridge known as the White Mountain, two armies prepare to decide the future of Bohemia. On one side, the Catholic League and imperial forces, well-trained, well-fed, their banners marked with the cross. On the other, the Protestant army of Bohemia, smaller, poorly supplied, but fighting for their homes and their faith. The battle begins with cannon fire echoing across the frost-covered ground. The Catholic infantry advances in steady lines, their armor glinting in the pale light. The Bohemians fight back fiercely, but their formations begin to falter under the relentless push. The Catholic cavalry charges the flanks, breaking the Protestant lines. Panic spreads. What was once an army becomes a fleeing mob. In less than 2 hours, the fate of Bohemia is sealed. Prague falls without much resistance. Frederick V, the Winter King, flees into exile, his reign lasting barely a season. For the people of Bohemia, the defeat means more than a change of ruler. It means executions, confiscations of land, and forced conversion to Catholicism. The rebellion is crushed, but the war has only just begun. The defeat at White Mountain should have ended the fighting. Bohemia was crushed, its leaders executed or driven into exile, its faith forcibly reshaped under Habsburg rule. But war is never so tidy. The Protestant cause did not die with Bohemia. Frederick V still had allies in the Palatinate, in the Protestant Union, and among foreign powers who feared the growing dominance of the Catholic League. To the north, Denmark and Sweden eyed the chaos with interest. To the west, France, though Catholic, watched uneasily as the Habsburgs tightened their grip on the heart of Europe. The fighting spilled beyond Bohemia. The Palatinate became the next target, its rich lands and strategic position too tempting for the Catholic League to ignore. Imperial forces swept through its towns, burning those that resisted, quartering soldiers in those that surrendered. For civilians, there was no difference between victory and defeat. Both meant plunder, both meant hunger. The war began to shift in nature. It was no longer just a religious conflict. It was becoming a struggle for territory, for wealth, and for survival in a Europe where alliances shifted with the wind. And with each passing year, more armies took the field, and more civilians were caught between them. By 1621, the war had taken on a new, more dangerous character. Mercenary companies, thousands strong, marched across Central Europe, fighting not for faith or king, but for whoever could pay them. These soldiers of fortune had no homeland to defend, no villages to protect. When their wages ran out, they simply took what they needed from the land: food, livestock, valuables, even the roofs from cottages. But over the peasants, this meant that the arrival of an army, Catholic or Protestant, was cause for terror. Barns were emptied, fields trampled, families left homeless as soldiers burned what they couldn't carry. Some mercenary captains became infamous for their cruelty. They would ransom entire towns for gold, then sack them anyway. They tortured suspected hoarders for grain, hanged peasants accused of hiding livestock, and treated the countryside as a larder to be stripped bare. Disease followed in their wake: typhus, dysentery, plague. Illness spread through both armies and villages, carried by lice, by rats, and by the endless movement of desperate people. It was in these years that civilians began to understand that there would be no safe side in this war. Spring 1631. Magdeburg, a Protestant city on the Elbe River, had withstood months of siege by the forces of the Catholic League. Inside the walls, food was running low, disease was spreading, and morale was breaking. The city's leaders hoped for relief from Protestant allies, but help was slow in coming. By May, the besieging army, commanded by Johann Cercles, Count of Tilly, decided to end it. On the morning of May 20th, Imperial troops stormed the walls. The defenders fought fiercely at first, but once the lines broke, the city became a slaughterhouse. Soldiers poured through the streets, killing without distinction. Men, women, children. Houses were set alight. The wind carried the flames from roof to roof until whole districts were burning. People fled toward the cathedral, hoping for sanctuary. But even there, the killing did not stop. By the end, Magdeburg was nothing but blackened ruins. Of its 30,000 inhabitants, fewer than 5,000 survived. The event shocked Europe, not because such massacres were rare, but because it was so complete, so absolute, that Magdeburgization became a word for the total destruction of a city. The destruction of Magdeburg should have been a warning, a sign that the war had gone too far. Instead, it only hardened resolve on both sides. Protestant leaders across Europe used the massacre as proof of Catholic brutality. Pamphlets were printed, sermons delivered, all calling for vengeance. Meanwhile, the Catholic League pointed to Magdeburg as a demonstration of their power, a warning to other cities considering rebellion. The conflict, once a regional war within the Holy Roman Empire, was now drawing in powers from across the continent. Sweden, under King Gustavus Adolphus, entered the war with a disciplined army and a reputation for military innovation. Their arrival shifted the balance and brought the fighting deeper into German lands. France, though Catholic, would soon support the Protestant cause, driven by its rivalry with the Habsburgs rather than by faith. The war was no longer about religion alone. It was a struggle for dominance over the political map of Europe, and every major power saw an opportunity to gain from the chaos. But for the people in the villages and towns of the empire, it didn't matter whose flag an army carried. Every army brought the same things: hunger, disease, fire, and death. In 1630, the war gained a new champion for the Protestant cause, King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. To his supporters, he was the Lion of the North, a warrior king sent by God. To his enemies, he was a foreign invader bringing yet another wave of bloodshed. Gustavus was no ordinary monarch. He was a skilled strategist, a commander who believed in leading from the front. His army was disciplined, well-drilled, and armed with lighter, more mobile artillery that could strike quickly and reposition with speed unheard of in European warfare. The Swedes landed in Pomerania, quickly securing the coastline and pushing inland. They won over many Protestant towns, offering protection in exchange for loyalty. To some civilians, the arrival of the Swedish king felt like salvation, a force that might finally drive the imperial armies away. But salvation in the 30 Years' War was fleeting. Swedish troops still needed food, quarters, and supplies. And when towns could not provide enough, they took it. Even the best disciplined soldiers could become predators when hunger set in. In 1631, Gustavus won a stunning victory at the Battle of Breitenfeld, breaking the Catholic League's dominance in northern Germany. It was a turning point, but also a signal that the war was far from over. For every battle won, the fighting simply shifted to a new region, and wherever the armies marched, the land withered behind them. The victory at Breitenfeld gave the Protestant cause new life. But in this war, momentum was a fragile thing. Every gain was met with a counterattack, and every counterattack meant another swath of Europe burned. Gustavus pushed south into Bavaria, striking at the heart of the Catholic League's territory. His armies moved fast, using their mobility to outmaneuver heavier imperial forces. Villages surrendered quickly, hoping to avoid the fate of Magdeburg. But surrender offered no real safety. An army on the march consumed everything in its path. Grain stores were emptied, livestock seized, and homes stripped of anything valuable. The people learned to hide what they could, burying food in fields or driving herds into forests at the sight of approaching troops. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. In 1632, the two great commanders, Gustavus Adolphus and Count Tilly, met again in battle at Rainham-Lech. Tilly was mortally wounded, his death a symbolic blow to the Catholic League. But the war had no shortage of men to take his place. For every general who fell, another stepped forward, ready to continue the slaughter. More that same year, Gustavus would fight his last battle at Lutzen and meet his own end on the field, leaving the Protestant cause without its lion, November 16, 1632. The fields outside the small town of Lutzen are swallowed in thick fog. It is here that Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, rides into battle for the last time. The fighting is fierce and chaotic. Cannons thunder, muskets crack through the mist, and lines of soldiers vanish into smoke before clashing in the mud. Gustavus, known for leading from the front, rides deep into the melee. It is his strength and his fatal weakness. Somewhere in the confusion, the king is cut off from his guard. Shots ring out, and he falls from his horse, mortally wounded. When the battle ends, the Swedes claim victory, but their king lies dead in the churned earth. His death is a blow to Protestant morale, but the war does not end. It simply changes hands. New generals rise, alliances shift again, and the fighting grinds on without clear purpose. For the civilians of the Holy Roman Empire, it no longer matters who wins a given battle. The war has taken on a life of its own, feeding on plunder, fear, and the misery of those who cannot escape it. The death of a king was supposed to be a turning point. Instead, it is just another chapter in a war that refuses to die. By the mid-1630s, the land itself had become the war's greatest casualty. Years of marching armies had stripped the countryside bare. Fields were left unplanted, orchards hacked down for firewood, and villages abandoned after repeated raids. Where crops had once grown, there were only weeds and ash. Famine took hold with a slow, merciless grip. Families boiled grass and tree bark for food. Parents starved themselves to feed their children, and sometimes those children still didn't survive the winter. Armies knew how to use this suffering to their advantage. Destroying food supplies could force enemy garrisons to surrender without a single shot fired. It was a strategy as old as war itself, but in the 30 Years' War, it was applied with a cold, deliberate cruelty. The starving began to follow the armies, hoping to find scraps from the soldiers' tables. Most found only disease. Typhus and plague spread through refugee camps, turning them into graveyards. By now, for much of the Holy Roman Empire, war was not a matter of front lines. It was everywhere. A fog of destruction that blurred the lines between home and battlefield. In 1635, a new player entered the war, one that would tip the scale toward even greater destruction. France had watched the conflict for years, carefully balancing its role. Though Catholic, it feared the power of the Habsburgs more than it valued religious unity. So in a calculated move, France declared war on Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, throwing its armies into the already burning heart of Europe. With France's entry, the war became fully international. German lands now faced not just their own internal conflicts, but the ambitions of foreign kings fighting battles far removed from the original cause. French troops clashed with imperial forces across the Rhineland, laying siege to fortified towns and tearing through the countryside. The Habsburgs countered with their own offensives, and soon the war had stretched from the North Sea to the Alps. For civilians, this expansion meant one thing. There were now more armies to fear, more banners that brought the same hunger, the same fires, the same plague. The 30 Years' War had started as a spark in Prague. Now it was a wildfire consuming all of Central Europe. By the late 1630s, the Holy Roman Empire was no longer a unified realm. It was a patchwork of territories, each ravaged by whichever army passed through last. Mercenary companies roamed with little oversight. Some still fought under royal banners, but many acted as independent predators, switching allegiances when the pay ran dry. Without wages, these men took their payment in kind. Entire villages were stripped bare, cattle driven off, and homes pulled apart for firewood. Those who resisted were beaten, hanged, or left to die in the ashes of their homes. In some regions, there was no functioning government at all. Local rulers had fled or been killed, their lands reduced to open hunting grounds for soldiers and bandits alike. Peasants armed themselves where they could, forming desperate militias to defend their food stores. But wooden pikes and farming tools were no match for seasoned soldiers with muskets and steel. Resistance often ended in slaughter. Law and order had collapsed. The war was no longer just between kings and generals. It was a war of all against all, and the weak were the easiest prey. As the 1640s began, an entire generation had grown up knowing nothing but war. Children born during the defenestration of Prague were now adults, and many of them had never seen a year without soldiers in the fields. The land itself bore the scars. Farms that had fed villages for centuries lay abandoned, overgrown with weeds. Irrigation systems rotted away. Bridges collapsed into rivers that no one dared to cross. Some regions had lost over half their population. The survivors huddled in ruined towns or wandered as refugees, searching for work, shelter, and bread. Even those places spared direct fighting still felt the war's chokehold. Trade routes were dangerous, taxes soared to pay for armies, and famine could arrive without warning when soldiers passed through and stripped the countryside. The war had gone on so long that its original causes were little more than faded memory. The spark in Prague was decades past. Now it was about survival, and about who could hold the most land when the killing finally stopped, if it ever stopped. By the mid-1640s, the 30 Years' War had twisted so far from its beginnings that yesterday's allies were today's enemies. France and Sweden, once united against the Habsburgs, now eyed each other with suspicion over the spoils of war. The Catholic League had long since fractured, its princes more concerned with defending their own territories than following imperial orders. Even within single armies, officers argued over loyalties. Some had served 3 or 4 different masters in as many years, switching sides when pay or promises shifted. This constant betrayal made diplomacy nearly impossible. Peace talks would begin, only for one side to launch a surprise attack before the ink on the proposals had dried. For civilians, this chaos meant no one could be trusted. A garrison that swore to protect a town 1 month might be flying the enemy's colors the next. Promises of safe passage could dissolve into robbery or worse. The war had become less about ideology and more about power, gold, and survival. And in that kind of war, trust was a luxury no one could afford. By 1646, Europe was exhausted, but exhaustion alone doesn't end wars. Instead, both sides sought one last chance to win enough ground to dictate the terms of peace. France and Sweden pressed deeper into the Holy Roman Empire, capturing fortified towns and key rivers. The Habsburgs, desperate to hold on, threw everything they had into counteroffensives, even as their treasuries ran dry. Mercenary armies were still on the march, though their numbers were smaller now. Years of constant fighting had drained the pool of willing men. Those who remained were hardened, more dangerous than ever, and unafraid to take what they wanted from the land. The countryside suffered the same fate it always had. Burned fields, emptied barns, and families fleeing in all directions. Even in the war's final years, entire regions were reduced to wasteland in a matter of weeks. And yet, in the shadows of all this destruction, delegates were already meeting in the Westphalian cities of Münster and Osnabrück, drafting the terms of a peace that would, at least on paper, end the bloodshed. But until those terms were signed, the killing would continue. The war's end was in sight, but for the soldiers still in the field, there was no reason to stop fighting. In 1648, even as diplomats finalized the terms of peace, armies clashed in brutal final engagements. The Battle of Lens in the Spanish Netherlands saw French forces crush the Spanish army, a symbolic victory that strengthened France's hand at the negotiating table. In the German heartland, smaller battles still flared over towns, bridges, and grain stores. These fights weren't about ideology anymore. They were about spoils. For civilians, the war's closing months were as dangerous as any before. With pay uncertain and discipline fraying, soldiers looted more aggressively than ever, knowing they might soon be disbanded. In October 1648, the Peace of Westphalia was signed. The treaties redrew borders, recognized the sovereignty of dozens of states within the empire, and for the first time in decades, promised an end to the fighting. But for the survivors, peace did not mean safety. The land was shattered, cities lay in ruins, and famine and plague still claimed lives long after the armies had gone. The 30 Years' War had ended, but its scars would last for generations. When the Peace of Westphalia was signed, the rulers of Europe spoke of balance, sovereignty, and diplomacy. But for the people who had lived through the 30 Years' War, the only measure that mattered was how many had been lost. Modern estimates vary, but the toll was staggering. Some regions of the Holy Roman Empire lost between a third and a half of their population. In some rural districts, there was simply no one left. The dead were not just soldiers. For every man killed in battle, many more civilians died from hunger, exposure, or disease. Entire family lines ended. Villages vanished from the maps, their names remembered only in parish records that stopped mid-sentence. The survivors carried scars that would never fade. Some had lived in hiding for years, emerging to find their homes gone and their fields claimed by others. Others returned to towns where nothing stood but the skeletons of burned-out buildings. The war had reshaped Europe's political map, but it had also erased communities, languages, and traditions that would never return. The 30 Years' War had begun as a holy struggle. At least that's what its leaders claimed. Protestant against Catholic, God's will against heresy. By the time it ended, those banners of faith had been traded for the language of sovereignty and statecraft. The Peace of Westphalia was a turning point in European politics. It recognized the independence of dozens of states within the Holy Roman Empire, allowing each to choose its own religion without interference from the emperor. It also redrew borders and acknowledged the growing power of nation-states like France and Sweden. Religion was not gone from politics, but it no longer dictated alliances as it once had. France had fought alongside Protestants despite being Catholic. Catholic powers had warred with each other for territorial advantage. The old idea of a unified Christendom was shattered. In its place came the modern concept of the state, a realm defined not just by faith, but by borders, armies, and the will of its ruler. This shift would shape Europe for centuries, laying the groundwork for future wars fought in the name of power rather than God. But for the peasants, merchants, and townsfolk who had endured 30 years of blood and fire, these political shifts meant little. Peace might have changed the rulers' maps, but it did not refill their grain stores or rebuild their burned homes. When the soldiers finally marched away, what they left behind was not peace, but emptiness. In some villages, only a handful of families remained. The rest had been killed, fled, or vanished without record. Fields lay untilled, their boundaries lost beneath weeds and wild growth. Rebuilding was slow and dangerous. Bandits roamed the countryside, many of them former soldiers who had nowhere else to go. With so many young men dead, whole communities struggled to find enough hands for the harvest. Trade routes that had been the arteries of Europe's economy were now scarred with broken bridges and ruined roads. Merchants feared the open road, and famine loomed in regions that had once been rich in grain. The psychological toll was just as deep. Survivors had lived decades in a world where life could be taken without warning or reason. Trust between communities, and even between neighbors, was slow to return. Well, peace had been signed on paper, but for the people of Central Europe it would take generations before the word truly meant anything. The 30 Years' War had ended, but its influence was just beginning to spread beyond the continent. The Peace of Westphalia introduced a radical idea for the time. that states had the right to govern themselves without outside interference. This principle would eventually ripple across the world, shaping the treaties of later centuries and influencing revolutions in far-off lands. France emerged from the war as Europe's dominant power, its armies stronger and its borders expanded. Sweden claimed new territories along the Baltic, cementing its role as a northern empire. The Holy Roman Empire, however, was permanently weakened. The emperor's authority had been stripped down, leaving the German states more independent than ever, but also more divided. Beyond politics, the war changed the way armies were built and sustained. The old reliance on short-term mercenaries was giving way to professional, permanent armies, a shift that would make future wars even larger and more devastating. The lessons learned about diplomacy, alliances, and the costs of prolonged conflict would echo through every major European war that followed. But as history would prove, those lessons were rarely enough to prevent the next catastrophe. History often remembers wars in terms of battles and treaties, but the 30 Years' War was also written in the lives of the people who endured it, and in the silences left behind by those who did not. In a burned-out village in Bohemia, a woman named Anna returned to the place she had fled as a child. The church was roofless, the cemetery overgrown. She found the remains of her family's home, but nothing else. No familiar faces, no one to tell her where the others had gone. In the Rhineland, a blacksmith named Lucas had spent years following different armies, mending weapons and tools in exchange for food. When peace came, he tried to go back to his trade, but the town he once served had no forge and no coin to pay him. And in a remote Bavarian hamlet, a boy named Matthias grew up believing that armies were a natural part of the landscape, as common as the seasons. When the war ended, he was 14 years old, and for the first time, the road outside his village was empty. These lives, and millions like them, were the true ledger of the 30 Years' War, a record measured not in territory won, but in futures stolen. For those who had lived through it, the 30 Years' War was unforgettable. But for the generations that followed, its horrors began to blur, and in some places, to vanish entirely from the record. In rural villages, there were no historians to write down what happened. The stories were passed by word of mouth about burned churches, vanished families, and winters without bread. But as the decades rolled on, even those voices grew quiet. Rulers preferred it that way. The war's chaos had been a shame as much as a tragedy, and in many courts it was better to speak of victories and treaties than of famine, plague, and the failure to protect their own subjects. Yet in other places, the memory was sharpened into warning. In Sweden, the victories of Gustavus Adolphus were immortalized in song and monument. In France, the war was retold as proof of the nation's strength and destiny. For them, the narrative was not about the suffering, but about the glory. And so history began to split. For the powerful, the 30 Years' War was a story of political triumph. For the survivors, it was a nightmare best left unspoken. The Peace of Westphalia ended the bloodshed, but it also set patterns that would shape Europe for centuries. The recognition of state sovereignty made it harder for empires to impose their will across the continent. This reduced the likelihood of continent-wide religious wars. but it also entrenched divisions that could be exploited in future conflicts. For Germany, the war's destruction left it fragmented and weak, a patchwork of semi-independent states that would not unite for more than 200 years. This weakness made the region a battlefield in later wars, from the 7 Years' War to the Napoleonic invasions. The economic damage was staggering. Trade hubs like Augsburg and Nuremberg never fully recovered their former dominance. Populations in some areas took a century to return to pre-war levels. Even in the cultural sphere, the 30 Years' War cast a long shadow. Art and literature from the German Stati turned somber, haunted by themes of loss, ruin, and the fragility of life. And although the cannons had gone silent, Europe's ruling houses kept their swords close at hand. The peace was not a true reconciliation. It was a pause, a breath before the next great conflict. The 30 Years' War didn't just destroy nations. It reinvented how wars were fought. At the war's start in 1618, armies were small by modern standards, often made up of short-term mercenaries. By its end, the need to sustain massive campaigns over decades had given rise to a new kind of military. Professional, permanent, and loyal to the state, rather than a single noble. France led the way in building standing armies, trained year-round and supplied through state-controlled logistics. This made wars faster to start, but also harder to end. Once a state had a permanent army, it was far too easy to find reasons to use it. The war also refined siege warfare to a brutal art. Starvation became as common a weapon as the cannon. Engineers designed elaborate fortifications, while attackers developed equally elaborate ways to breach them. Gunpowder weapons dominated the battlefield, forcing changes in armor, tactics, and formations. The days of heavily armored knights were gone. Muskets and artillery had made them obsolete. These changes meant that the 30 Years' War wasn't just a European tragedy. It was a blueprint for the large-scale, state-driven conflicts that would define the modern age. The 30 Years' War had been born in the flames of religious conflict, but it ended in a world where faith no longer dictated the map. The Peace of Westphalia enshrined the principle that each state could choose its own religion, Catholic, Lutheran, or Calvinist, without interference from outside powers. It was a revolutionary shift, a formal recognition that political borders mattered more than spiritual unity. In practice, this meant that religion adapted to survive. Churches rebuilt in ruined towns, but now under the protection of local rulers rather than distant empires. Clergy learned to serve within the boundaries of their state's politics, often becoming instruments of national identity. For ordinary believers, the change was subtle but profound. Faith was no longer the cause for which armies marched. It became something more personal, a matter of community and private conviction. But the wounds left by decades of religious violence would take far longer to heal. In border regions, suspicion lingered between Catholics and Protestants. Mixed towns bore quiet divides that would last for generations. The war had not ended religion, but it had stripped it of its crown, forcing it to live in the shadow of politics. In the decades after the war, a strange transformation began to take place. From the ashes of devastation, a new culture emerged, one shaped as much by loss as by survival. The artists, writers, and composers who had grown up in the war's shadow turned their experiences into work that was dark, sober, and deeply human. Gone were the ornate celebrations of courtly life that had dominated before 1618. In their place came paintings of ruined landscapes, literature that mourned the fragility of peace, and music steeped in melancholy. Folk traditions also shifted. Songs and tales passed down in rural communities often spoke of famine, fire, and wandering soldiers. Even in celebration, there was an undercurrent of caution, a reminder that joy could vanish overnight. Architecture reflected the same mood. Churches and civic buildings rebuilt after the war were often sturdier, plainer, and more functional than their predecessors. Opulence was out of place in towns still counting their dead. This cultural change wasn't just aesthetic. It was a way of coping. By reshaping art and tradition to reflect hardship, survivors preserved the memory of the war and warned the generations that followed. Rebuilding after the 30 Years' War was not the work of kings and diplomats. It was the work of ordinary people. Peasants returned to overgrown fields, pulling weeds from the furrows and patching the roofs of abandoned cottages. Merchants reopened shops in half-collapsed buildings, trading in whatever goods they could find. In towns where the population had been cut in half, families from neighboring regions were invited to settle. Some came willingly, seeking new beginnings. Others arrived because they had nowhere else to go. Refugees from other parts of Europe still torn by conflict. There were years when the harvest failed and famine returned. There were winters when disease swept through towns, still too weak to resist it. But slowly, the rhythm of life returned. The people who rebuilt these towns rarely thought of themselves as making history. They were simply surviving, one day at a time. Yet it was their hands, not the generals, that truly brought the war to an end. When the smoke cleared, Europe had an opportunity to reflect, to learn from 3 decades of destruction. Some lessons stuck. Rulers understood that prolonged, religiously driven wars could destroy not only their enemies, but their own realms. Diplomacy gained new importance, and the Peace of Westphalia became a model for future treaties. But other lessons were ignored. The professional armies born from the war remained in place, ready to be unleashed in the next conflict. The competition for territory, resources, and prestige did not vanish. It simply changed form. The war had proven that alliances could cross religious lines, and future conflicts would be shaped more by politics than by faith. Yet the ambition that fueled the 30 Years' War remained alive in every court in Europe. In this way, the 30 Years' War was both a warning and a blueprint. It showed the cost of unchecked conflict, but also demonstrated how much could be gained by those willing to endure it. 4 centuries have passed since the first musket was fired in Prague, but the shadow of the 30 Years' War still lingers in Europe's memory. In Germany, some towns still bear scars, old stone walls pocked by cannon fire, half-forgotten mass graves beneath quiet fields. Local legends preserve the memory of sieges, famines, and miraculous survivals. In Sweden and France, the war is remembered differently, as a chapter of national pride, a time when their armies reshaped the balance of power. Historians still debate its meaning. Was it a needless catastrophe that set back Central Europe for centuries, or was it the painful birth of the modern state system that now defines global politics? For the ordinary people who lived through it, those questions would have meant little. For them, The war was not an abstract lesson. It was the loss of children, the burning of homes, and the sound of marching boots in the night. In the centuries that followed, the 30 Years' War became more than history. It became a warning. Statesmen studied it as an example of how religious zeal could spiral into unending destruction. Military strategists examined its campaigns to understand the dangers of fighting on too many fronts for too long. Writers and philosophers used it as proof that war corrodes the very society it claims to defend. Some compared it to a sickness, a fever that gripped Europe and only broke when the patient was nearly dead. In the German states especially, the memory of the war was used to urge caution. Even when new conflicts arose, politicians invoked the 30 Years' War as a reason to avoid total devastation. And yet, human nature being what it is, Europe still returned to war again and again. The lesson was remembered, but not always followed. The 30 Years' War was not the first great tragedy of Europe, and it would not be the last. But its scale, its cruelty, and its sheer length set it apart in the history of human conflict. But it was a war that began with the rhetoric of righteousness and ended with the cold calculations of politics. It turned neighbors into enemies, cities into graves, and kingdoms into hollow shells of their former power. It forced the birth of modern diplomacy, but at a price so high that no treaty could balance the ledger. The stories that survive from those years of starvation, betrayal, and endurance are more than historical anecdotes. They are warnings about how easily civilization can unravel when ambition and fear outweigh compassion. And yet, the fact that Europe emerged from this darkness at all is a testament to human resilience. The same people who saw their world destroyed also rebuilt it, stone by stone, field by field. By the time the century turned, the last survivors of the 30 Years' War were old and fading. They had lived through a world most could not imagine, and their memories were a bridge between the age of fire and the fragile peace that followed. Some spoke of it often, warning their children never to trust the promises of kings. Others carried their memories in silence, afraid to reopen wounds that had taken decades to scar over. In small villages, elders would point to empty fields and say, "Here, there was once a church," or "Once, this road was lined with houses." To younger generations, these were just stories, but to those who had lived it, they were grave markers without names. As the witnesses passed, the war moved fully into the realm of history, but not into forgetfulness. Its echoes lived on in architecture, in songs, and in the unspoken caution that guided politics for years to come. The 30 Years' War left Europe transformed, politically, militarily, and emotionally. It reshaped borders and gave rise to the modern system of states. It taught leaders the value of diplomacy, even if they didn't always listen to the lesson. It turned religion from the cause of great wars into just one tool in the arsenal of power. But its deeper legacy was written in the lives it shattered. Generations grew up in the shadow of scarcity, learning caution as a way of life. Cities rebuilt, but many never regained their former glory. And in the collective memory of Central Europe, the war became a kind of scar tissue, a reminder of how quickly the familiar can vanish and how hard it is to reclaim what's lost. The Peace of Westphalia may have been the war's official end, but its real ending was slower, measured not in treaties signed, But in fields plowed again, markets reopened, and the sound of church bells returning to towns where they had been silent for decades. When the guns fell silent in 1648, Europe exhaled. But it was not the sigh of relief one might expect. It was the breath of exhaustion, of a continent too tired to mourn. In the decades that followed, the war's ruins were overgrown. Its graves were covered by grass, its burned villages reclaimed by forest. The land healed faster than the people. For those who study history, the 30 Years' War is a case study, a turning point in diplomacy, a shift in military science, a birth of the modern state. But for those who lived it, it was something simpler and more terrible. 30 years in which death became ordinary and peace became a rumor. It stands as a warning of how ideology can ignite a fire that burns beyond anyone's control, and how the pursuit of power can blind rulers to the suffering of their own people. And yet, in the quiet after the storm, people rebuilt. They planted fields, repaired walls, and tried to love again in a world that had taught them how fragile love could be. This is the true end of the 30 Years' War. Not the treaty, not the politics, but the simple, stubborn act of living after history's darkest night.